Thank you, Brian, and it's great to see such a big crowd tonight. We are very honored to bring you a gentleman who has an outstanding presence in Rochester. He's been a local businessman downtown for over 40 years. He's the author of historical adventure novels for young adults, and his books are used in many schools for their social studies content and historical content. He's a past member of the Rochester JCs and the Rochester City Council. He was Mayor Pro Tem 1994 and 95, and the Rochester Christmas Parade Grand Marshal in 2001. He's also a longtime member of the Historical Society. Please welcome Rochester's Main Street pharmacist, Bob Lytle.
Does this work, everybody? Okay. I'm not used to using one. I'd love to have one in my store, so I ain't cradling that phone on my ear all the time. It's a great pleasure to be here. I certainly wasn't expecting a crowd like this. I have been, in fact, been shut out at certain times when invited to speak at a place or something and nobody showed up. So that's humiliating, all right, but it sets you in your place in a hurry. But this is just terrific. That's oops, I think we got a rainstorm. We'll watch for drops. I'm here to talk mainly about the building, my drugstore. I say my drugstore. I'm just a new guy. I've only been there for 40 years, but that drugstore goes back in history. And I'll start with a little bit of Rochester's history. Most of you know that Rochester was settled by James Graham in 1817, and it wasn't really too much longer after that that Roland Sprague, Dr. Roland Sprague, a young doctor from Detroit, met his wife, and she was the daughter of a merchant in Rochester, and so he came out here to live. The father had a dry goods store. And so Roland Sprague, having married into the family, started Rochester's first drugstore. And it was in 1832 that he came and he became part of the family business, selling medical supplies and so on. So he established or he built the what is now the bakery, home bakery on the other end of 4th or 3rd and Main instead of 4th and Main. But so that started really the first drugstore in Rochester, and it was a continuous succession of other people after Roland Sprague. Then when it got to John Norton, he had the drugstore He had the drugstore and he put it on the corner of 4th and Main. But that wasn't the building that it's in now. It was a smaller building, and he got together with a banker, and they recognized the need to have a presence in Rochester to attract people from other communities, New York especially, coming to Michigan, and to attract them to Rochester. That would do nothing but help the business climate in town. John Norton was a pharmacist, had that drugstore, and he got together with a banker, and they created the Opera House. As many of you know, there was never an opera in the Opera House, but it was a fancy title, and that would attract people to the town, let people know that Rochester is a lively town and a place that they could bring their families and their businesses and set up shop and be assured of having a good business climate. So they built the Opera House, 1890, and so ever since then, there's been a few owners. John Norton was there until 1928. Zeno Schoolcraft, anyone remember Zeno? He was from 28 to 46. Ken Fetters was owned the drugstore. A lot of you remember Ken Fetters, and he was there from 46 to 58, I think, and then Dick Morley had it from then until when he passed away in 1972 in a plane crash. Now, at about that time is when I came to town. I was working for Perry Drugs. I'm sure a lot of you remember Perry Drugs, and it was taken over by Rite Aid. But I came here. My wife and I had been married for a few years, and we were looking for a town to settle in for me to create a drugstore. And so I've been working at Perry's for just a few years. And when Dick Morley died, and I found that the current owner then was a fellow by the name of Al Mazie. He had a whole bunch of stores down in Detroit, and he wasn't really putting a lot of effort into the store in Rochester. So it occurred to me that it would be an opportunity to buy the store, and sure enough, they sold it to me, and we had to do everything but give our first son to the bank to get all the money put together, but we managed to do it. So that's kind of where I came in. But it was over the years that the building has changed somewhat, and it was built in 1890, as I said, with a structure that looked like this. I've got a number of pictures and postcards. In fact, it was a postcard that Eric Kettleson, Eric's here. Where'd he go? There he is. Eric used a fine magnifying glass to determine how many layers of bricks were supposed to be the way it was built in 1890. But in about Dick Morley did it in the probably early 60s. Modernized the front of the store to a much different and probably more energy efficient facade. But it certainly wasn't as pretty as what had originally been built in 1890. So when it became a chance to buy the building, and I'll show you what started that. I'd like to. I don't know if you can see it. I'm going to set one of these on this side, one on the other side. I wasn't expecting this many people. But this is an event that happened in March of 1986, 85 or 86. Somewhere in March, there was a big windstorm, and it blew in one of the windows of the big arched windows upstairs. Blew it. And here I was, I'd been working there at the store, the drugstore part, for 10 years. And that, if you look at those pictures, you can see that the glass wasn't even broken. That's how well built this thing was. But the whole arch was blown right in, and something had to be done. It had to be fixed. And I wasn't the owner of the building. The owner of the building said, "Well, we'll just brick it in." Oh, you can't do that. This building is the icon of beautiful setting for Rochester. You just can't do that. And they said, "Well, it's a lot cheaper," and they didn't really care. So the DDA was just in its early stages at that point, the Downtown Development Authority in Rochester, and so I went to them to see if there was some way we could do something about that. And they said, "Well, the only way you can do it is if you buy the building, and then we'll, and I said, I can afford the building, barely afford the rent on it." And and I was, of course, busy at the store, all day long, answering phones and filling prescriptions, and that time using a typewriter. You had computers back then. And so I just didn't have the ability at the time or the knowledge to be able to pull off such a big thing as purchasing a building. And the DDA, the director at that time, Susie Affleck-Child was the director, and she saw the importance of salvaging the building as it was instead of having it bricked in like that. And so she got going and made, also did all sorts of groundwork for getting me to get the financing and to buy the building. So that was a good year or so before that was accomplished, but it did come about. So it was because of that storm that I was able really to buy the building or start the process to get it. So that was a really important day, as disastrous as it seemed with the windstorm and all that. But so that was 10 years after I'd gotten a drugstore. So the next 30 years has seen a few other changes. But as I say, Eric Kettleson was instrumental in getting that work done, and there were a few days that was pretty scary. That Eric's nodding his head. He remembers very well that other situations that almost the building nearly collapsed as it was being renovated. But it got done, and so that's one of the changes. Also, Dick Morley at one time was just a simple freestanding building, and then during his term, he added that portion onto the back of the building, which is now my son's toy store, and above that is a beauty salon. The upstairs has been a number of things over the years. It was when we originally renovated the upstairs. It was just a wide open building, empty space. It was no structural, no beams or anything to hold up the ceiling. It was so well built that it didn't need any of those things. So it was really just like a gymnasium is what it was intended to be to begin with. The Opera House when it was originally built for dancing and for all sorts of community events and so on. So when it was renovated over the years, Dick Morley had an office upstairs. At one time, Pixley's had a furniture store, and the upstairs was sectioned off into little showrooms for his furniture. So it had been a number of things over those years, but it was the Opera House suddenly, due to the Depression in 1933, the trains could not come through town anymore. The trolleys, bringing the bands from Detroit, bringing the people for the dances and things that went on from 1890 until 1933 that made the Opera House really a going concern. So the Depression did two things. It also knocked out the bank. The bank failed. At one time there were 4 banks, one on each corner of 4th and Main. At one time, if you can imagine that. So the one that was in my building failed, as well as 2 others, and then only the one that is still there now remains. So the Depression did a lot to change the business structure downtown. So, and that was how it impacted the old Opera House building. So then let's see, where am I with my Pixley's, yeah, and then so when we renovated, when Eric got done with the upstairs, it was again a beautiful maple floored, 16-foot high ceilings, empty space, which we tried to lease out as for some tenant who would be able to use that space as it was and not have to divide it up, because it was just really spectacular. The floors and the big arched windows with the leaded glass, colored glass in the front. It was really a spectacular sight. One that hadn't been like that since the 30s. So in 1986, when Eric was done with that part of the process, we tried to lease it out to a tenant who could use it as it was, and we just struggled. Nobody. We had a couple of people. One had a low impact type of exercise facility, and that never went through. I thought for sure we had a tenant for it, with that person, but that failed. And then so finally we had to we got a tenant who divided up the upstairs into offices, and that's the way it is now. Although there's been several tenants over the years, we do have a law office up there now that is again doing restoration and renovating to the upstairs. So I'm anxious to see how that turns out. But it's they're almost done with it now. So that's kind of the story of the building and its different eras and different formats that we've been in. So and also in 1986, when we were doing the restoration of the pharmacy area, we rose the ceilings. So they had drop ceilings in it when it was renovated or when it was redone by Dick Morley, and that just didn't really suit the facade that we were returning to. So we went back to the high ceilings, and so that's the way it is now. Let's stop right now and ask if anyone has any questions about the building, because we're going to go on to another subject here.
Rob, were there windows on the side of the building on 4th Street originally?
Yeah, and yet I haven't found any pictures.
So it looks like
Yeah, you can see those were bricked in probably by Dick Morley when the bank failed in the 30s. The drugstore the bank was on the corner. Right on the building was in two sections. The bank was right on the corner. The drugstore was on the inner part of that. I've got a really nice picture of that, where it shows the pharmacy here and the bank here. When the bank failed, the pharmacy moved over to the corner, and then there was a hardware store that filled in where the drugstore was. And then it wasn't until Dick Morley, yeah, thank you. It's one of the pictures that...
pass around.
Oh, yeah, sure. This is really a neat picture because it's a mystery to me, and if anyone can tell me what was going on in front of the store, because you can see that there's some kind of construction going on, and yet it's not the original building phase of the store. So I'm at a loss as to what this little umbrella thing is here, and because I've had this picture, a smaller version of it, not as nice as this one, but we can figure that out. I appreciate it. That's what it looks like. It's exactly what it looks like, and it looks like there's some kind of activity going on, but I'll be darned if I can find out what it was. Gosh, the owner of John Norton, I might even mention something about John Norton. He had a running feud with Will Fox, who ran the Era, the Rochester-Era newspaper. It's apparently John Norton would have a little blurb in the front of every newspaper of the Era. Every week it would say something was on sale. And then I noticed when I was doing the research on the building, because I went here to the library, the old library, and I found microfilm of that era, because I had to trace back to get some of the funding to find out exactly when this place was built so I could get a designated historic site. So I was doing all sorts of microfilm looking at and going through all that stuff, and I came across this thing of John Norton every week would have this little ad about something that was he was for sale. And then one week, Will Fox, the editor of the newspaper, made some scathing remark about Norton's activities in the drugstore. There's been a liquor store there since before, during, and after Prohibition. So John apparently took offense to what Will had written, and so I just happened to notice that the next week there was nothing in. I thought, what prompted John Norton to not advertise anymore in this paper? And So I went the week before and I found that little blurb saying, John Norton will sell liquor to any fool kid. So that was, so just a little aside sort of thing that when you do research like, you know, like on something you really get involved with, you come across funny things like that. So, what was I? Oh, we were asking questions. Yes?
Two questions. One, is this you in the picture?
Yes.
And the second one is it says Detroit on the building across the street.
I think it was,
Is that a bank?
yeah, that was Detroit Bank and Trust. Yeah. What was it at the time? National Bank of Detroit. Yeah, I thought that was, like I say, that was 86, spring of 86, so to date that. Yep.
You said the upper floor was 16 feet high. Is the lower floor the same? Or if it was smaller, why did they make one smaller and one larger like that?
I think, Eric, was that right? The lower level isn't 60.
The lower floor had the ductwork for the air systems in it, and so that's why that ceiling is dropped.
Yeah, but the lower level wasn't 60. I think the upper level was 16 feet.
They had to be quite similar in the rough.
Yeah.
I don't remember exactly, but I know it was a lot of stairs to build.
And there was also spare space above the ceiling of the opera house. That's where all the trusses were to make the thing strong enough so you didn't need to have poles, you know, throughout. Yes.
I've recently seen a program on the Howl Opera House, and I'm just curious, an opera house, why were these big draws? Do we know whether those were the same architects? What was it like? I'm assuming that it really just meant like a performance center, so the idea was the upper floor would have been that performance area, and the lower floor was commercial?
Yeah.
Like,
Exactly.
and this was going to be a draw for New Yorkers?
No. Well, no, not New York City. New York State.
Yeah, coming down the area now, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, in the 1920s, well, 25, I think is when pardon me?
But yeah, but apparently performance venues like this were something that really attracted people, made the town seem vital.
Yes. I mean, I'm not sure that they would come for performances so much as for the activities that, the towns nearby that didn't have, people who were coming to Michigan anyway, because the land was cheap, they were selling it for $4 an acre, and so they were selling the land in New York State for $16 an acre, so, people thought that was a real, and they heard all sorts of wonderful things about how great the farmland was, and it was in many cases, in a lot of cases it wasn't, but people came anyway, and were very disappointed with farmland, especially north of us. But yeah, people were coming from the Erie. There was two routes, or one route was through Ohio, but the Erie Canal was a real boon to Michigan, bringing people not just from New York, of course, but anywhere on the East Coast. And a building or a town that had a place called an opera house, whether they ever intended to have an opera in it or not, was still a magical thing. So I encourage them to come, right?
Yeah, in response to your question, keep in mind at that time, downtown Rochester had two hotels. You had a train on the south end of town, ran from 16. You had north, that was east-west, you had the north-south, which was the Michigan Central. Plus you had the DUI, the Detroit United Railway, that ran 60 cars a day through town. Plus your two trains, and you had a lot of activity downtown. It was a booming place.
Yeah, those things all didn't happen at once. I think the first trains came in like late 60s, and the DUR came through in 1899. So there was that kind of commercial activity that was drawing railroads, and of course when a railroad would come through a town, that would be a huge advantage to that town. Some towns didn't want that sort of activities. Stony Creek, for example, tried to avoid the commercialism. They wanted their town left as it was, and it was left as it was. So, but for anybody that had a business, and of course, if you lived in a town and you were influenced by the business climate of that town, then you were all for anything that would, help the businesses survive. So, yeah, that's the idea behind creating an opera house. Another question? All right. I got involved with writing, and I worked on Mackinac while I was in college at pharmacy school, and so I worked there for 4 summers, and it had just a wee of a time, actually. It was wonderful. A lot of fun, and I was out all day working in one job I worked as to carry luggage to the Island House Hotel. You've probably been to Mackinac, you've seen guys riding their bicycles with suitcases up. That's what I did my first year. And then from that job, I got the job on the yacht dock, tying up boats from the yachts from all over the Great Lakes, and that was and there is no better job than that for a college kid to just be outdoors and have fun, and it was wonderful. But anyway, so I had those 4 years working on Mackinac Island until I graduated from Ferris, and I had to get a real job and a pay cut, mind you. The tips were pretty good there on the yacht dock. So I started with a store in Lansing, and then moved off to Perry Drugs, and then they transferred me here to Rochester when the store was being built, which is now the Rite Aid there at Walton and Livernois. So I was there for 3 years, and all that time, my wife and I, we had 1 son at that time, and that's not what I wanted, because they're not easy working for a chain store. And then they sent me to Pontiac to work there, and I lived in Rochester, but every day I went to Pontiac and worked in one of their downtown stores, and that really settled my decision to try to manufacture, buy, build, somehow start a drugstore in town. And it was right at that time that Dick Morley died, and I started researching the possibility of buying that store. So that got me in that part of my business. But it was about then that my sons were growing up, and all this time with my sons, I loved to write. As they were growing up, I use this expression, you don't always have a camera when you want one. And some of the silly things and goofy things that happened with my sons as they were growing up, they would, you'd wish, one of those situations where you wish you had your camera and then you never did. And so I started writing poems about them, and so I had a fair number of poems, and as they were growing up, and then when they got old enough, I decided I would, go for a grand slam and try to write a book. And when you write a book, you have to write about something you know about, and something that someone hasn't already written about. So I thought of Mackinac Island, and that's what prompted me to write my first 3 stories. Was some of the things that happened as I was growing up nearby Mackinac Island. We had a cottage in the Lachino Islands, which is just 17 miles from Mackinac. Nobody knows about it. It's a small little area of just lovely old homes, summer homes. People from Chicago and Cincinnati. My family inherited a very small cabin in the snows, and so that's where I spent my first summers until it was time to go to college, and that's when I started working on Mackinac. But so to get back to I started writing about Mackinac Island. Well, after my first 3 books were published, I I didn't want to be typecast as strictly writing about Mackinac Island. And right about that time, my sister was in South Carolina. She wanted to join the DAR. Very exclusive organization, of course, and very important in Carolinas to be in this DAR. And so she wrote to me and said, I think we've got some relative in your area, Rochester or somewhere right nearby, who was a member of the DAR, or was a daughter of the American Revolution. And she said, the name is Sarah Boardman, and her husband is Lemuel Taylor. Somehow, I don't know what prompted me to recognize that name, but sure enough, I went out to the museum and big tombstone of Sarah and Lemuel, and I started doing some tracing and found out, like I did tracing with the building, learning about the history of the building. I used the microfilm here and all the old records of the old. All the old records from all over Michigan, I guess, and traced it down to that sure enough, I'm the great-great-grandson of Eunice Taylor, Lemuel Taylor's youngest child. So I started, that really prompted my interest in the history of this area. When I moved here in 71, when we moved here, and then when I bought the drugstore, I really felt like I was an outsider. Just because so many people have such long historic backgrounds in town, and I just never really felt that, I didn't know how long it would take for me to live in town before I really felt like I belonged, like I was, really part of the institution that is known as Rochester. And then when I found this, oh, yeah? Here's to you, folks. I got my hip pocket. So anyway, that just gave me some confidence. And so I started doing a lot of research on what the town was like. And I knew that when my first three stories, these are the first Mackinac stories, were Summer Adventure, Boathouse Mystery, and The General's Treasure. And those took more and more history as I kept writing. The first one was just simply a kid's story about an adventure. And it gets more and more involved with the history of Mackinac Island as I got more interested in the history of that. But to do this Three Rivers Crossing, I really got into Oakland County history and Michigan history and United States history to really feel that part in the story. And I didn't think that I could write a history. And I who would want to read a history about, Rochester and Stony Creek? I mean, a few people, sure, but not enough to sell books. And so I decided to use time travel. We're a modern day kid who loves to go fishing, goes up to his favorite fishing hole at Stony Creek, and he gets trapped underwater. And this is some, you use events that happen in your own past in stories like this. When I was 11 years old, my dad and I went fly fishing on the Black River up in northern part of the eastern part of northern Lower Peninsula. Here. And as we were fishing, if you ever fly fished, you'll probably recognize this. You wear waders that come up to about here, and you're walking along the stream. Well, I stepped into a hole. I didn't know anything about holes in rivers. Flat. I mean, they ripple a little bit if you don't have holes. Well, I stepped in a hole, and I went in, and my waders got filled right up. And I got swept downstream. It was early summer, and I got swept downstream. And underneath, how those trees when they fall over, they're not all up here. Some of it's down here under the water, and I got caught underneath that. And I didn't think I was coming out, and that terrified me. And became a very memorable situation. I used that to start this story where the kid is fishing and he catches a grayling. He sees this fish jumping out of the water, and he's never seen anything like it. It's got this long backbone and back fin, and it's a big fish too. So he wants to land it. He does everything he can. In fact, he goes and gets caught underneath a tree, and he is drowning for sure. And the second chapter begins with him laying on his back, and there's some old guy with a beard and clothes, and he's surrounded by a bunch of other people, and the old guy is pumping air into him. He looks around, he realizes something here is very strange, and he thinks he's in amongst a bunch of reenactors, museum people that are all dressed up for some kind of a reenacting thing. And it isn't until he really talks to this boy, Lemuel Taylor's son, Danny, and who Danny is exactly the boy's age in the story, and they hit it off, and the boy in the story is able to convey to Danny Taylor that he's really from 2005, not from 1823, which is what he found himself in. So that's what starts that story. And it's really a fun story, right? Because it's about my family, and it's about Stony Creek. It's about something I really knew and was learning more and more about and really loved to research. And so the boy lives with this family, and of course, being a farm family on a new frontier, they had just moved there in 1823, and they were one of the first families in the Rochester area, in Stony Creek. And they needed all the help they could get, and one boy, no matter what century he was from, would be a big help. So they got along. He learned all sorts of stuff about what life was like back then. So that one came out, and that got me to working on something else. It was right about that time, 2000. I'd had 2 hip replacements, and I was not getting around terribly well. But Rochester Grangers, Al Smitley is here, and he's familiar with the Grangers. He plays for the Northville team. I joined the Grangers because I love baseball, and I love the idea of history being so important in playing vintage baseball. We play by the rules of the 1840s and 50s, and we don't roll up our sleeves, because ladies in the attendance would be appalled to see a gentleman with bared arms. I mean, my goodness, we just can't do that. We don't curse or swear or spit or slide or anything that would be ungentlemanly. And so all this went into the game of baseball, 2 words at that time. And as I was learning the rules of the game, I was in between books. I just finished this one, and I thought, wow, what a great idea for a story. I'll take this time travel idea that I used in this one and put it into a story about a boy who goes back in time to the Civil War era, which is when baseball really took off as a national pastime. It was because of the Civil War that it really took off. It had been a game played strictly by New York gentlemen, and they had clubs. They didn't have teams. Teams are for oxen and horses. So they had clubs, and so it was a social club. It wasn't. And it was a way for them to show off that they had, they had attained a status of being able to join a club and to have exercise. And it was a family thing. They would have games on the weekends and invite another team to come, and they would have dinner afterwards, and the families would have parties. And so it was really a very social thing. It's very different than nowadays. So this modern day kid, boy, who's a really good baseball player, but he comes up from down south, and he's got this horrendous southern accent. Here he is stuck in 1864, right, the real busy part of the Civil War. And he has to convince the people in Rochester that he's not a rebel, he's not a spy, he's just a kid who got kind of trapped in this position of being in 1864. So that's kind of the crux of that story. In that story, he learns what life was like again, what school was like, very different than nowadays. And I did a lot of research finding out what school was like in not only Rochester, but in the whole United States, is how things have changed with teachers and how you can behave and how you can't behave. And found out the hard way. And so there's a lot of little incidences in that story that have to do with Rochester and its period of what life was like here, how it affected, how the Civil War affected the commerce, the economy of Rochester. A lot of boys that would have been farm boys and helping out on the farm or helping out the various businesses in town weren't around to help. So again, he gets his chance to work in the drugstore because he's the person that has taken him in is the pharmacist, the local drugstore owner, John Norton, as it turns out. We talked about that little time variance there, right? A few facts get in the way of a good story. So John Norton is pillar. He's the town pharmacist, and he's the pillar of the community. He makes pills for everyone's a little pharmacy play on words. Sorry. But anyway, John Norton helps him with a lot of the things, and his daughter is also very helpful. And the son has lost a leg during the Civil War, so the son is not too happy about having this southern boy. The son sees through Matt Dugan's accent and knows that he's from Atlanta or somewhere in the South, and no one else seems to have figured it out. But the son, who had his leg shot off during the Civil War at Bull Run, was also very instrumental. And Matt gets the son to be on his side, and so that's kind of a fun part of the story. A lot of fun things that happen. And when your mind is in gear to entertain not only yourself, but hopefully, in most of these cases, middle grade students from third grade to junior high. And then after kids get grown up and quit being as smart as they think they are, adults, a lot of adults have told me that they couldn't put my book down, and they didn't know which one it was. I get a call I got a call from one lady, she was in her 90s, I swear. Tommy, you kept me up all night last night. I had no idea. Yeah, I picked up, I don't know, with the pitching timers, one of them, and she said, and I couldn't put it down. She said, and I couldn't even get any sleep, so I'm really upset with you. She was kidding, I think, but it was fun. So that's the baseball one. Then the interesting thing happened about 10 years ago. I decided that we've got now 6 grandchildren, and I could just see that at that time we had 2, I think. But I could just picture that there would be a time when the grandkids wouldn't want to come to our house in Rochester. It's a nice enough house and everything, but hardly something that anybody would go out of their way to come visit Grandma and Grandpa for. So I'd always wanted, or at least for a long time, wanted to live on a lake. And so finally my wife conceded she didn't want to leave Rochester, and I really didn't either, but we didn't have a lake to live on. So I had to, my oldest son Jeff is in real estate, and he found this place out in Lake Orion. And he took, in fact, it was the same day, Al Smitley, the same day that you and I played music for our Granger baseball game. His team was playing against our team, and I think Grand Rapids was also there at the same. But that same day, we were playing Civil War songs for the crowd for the Cranks at the baseball game. My wife went off with my son to see this house in Lake Orion on Indianwood Lake. And when I got home from the game, sweaty and just grungy, we played 3 games, I think. And I played fiddle, Al played fiddle, I played guitar, and we had a guy that played the hammered dulcimer. But anyway, got home from that, and Candy said, I loved it. Baseball, she finally just been turned around to liking vintage baseball, and she comes and watches. But and I said, really? What did we do that was so great? She said, no, not at the house. She saw the house that Jeff took her to. Had no idea the history of it, but she was in love with the house. And she said, it's just beautiful. It's just unbelievable. It's old. It's on the lake. You love being on the lake. That's what you want. But I love the house. So we got the house. And had no idea what the history of the house was. And found out, after doing, again, a whole lot of research, going to libraries and looking at old newspapers, that the house had belonged to and was built by a fellow by the name of Frank Blair. Frank Blair is probably not anyone you know, but he owned the Guardian building in Detroit. It's fabulous. Probably still the prettiest building in all of Detroit. It is. He owned that. He owned the bank. So he had built this cottage, summer home out on Indianwood. Actually, he built Indianwood Lake because he also owned the golf course, Indianwood Country Club. He had started that in, I think, 1923 or so. And then he decided that he would like to have a house, not in that order. He had a golf course, but he didn't have enough water to water the golf course. He had this little stream, the Paint Creek, going by. So he built the dam to build the lake to water his golf course. And he built the house to look over the lake. So he had dead west look. So we got sunset, the sunsets are spectacular. And then he lost it all in the Depression. He had these beautiful gardens, 6 foot high, 7 foot high walls, semicircular walls, 2 of them, one right at the lake and one up by the house. And my wife's a gardener, and she started working on that one down by the lake, and it was just filled up with old debris of trees that had grown up that were never planted there. It had been 50 years since anyone had done anything about those gardens. And so the first few years we really worked on the one garden down by the lake. And then we saw this other one that was totally overgrown by weeds and just all sorts of stuff. And so I started cutting all that down to try to reclaim that garden. And as I was doing that, that's when I was doing the research on Frank Blair. Found out that he had lost everything in the Depression, and that prompted me to start learning about the Depression. And the more I learned, the more I've got a story here. This could be a really cool story. And I used that time travel idea again, and I got my 2 grandsons in the story to come and help me build a labyrinth in this garden that I was reclaiming. And in the story, to go up with the boys, walk the labyrinth on midnight of Midsummer's Eve. As they're walking the labyrinth, they're going in, they're thinking about, as Grandpa and me had told them, the idea of a labyrinth is to ponder things and to, think about, serious things, maybe problems you're having in business or at school or with friends or something. And then on the way out of the labyrinth, the idea is you will solve that issue. And then that's the idea of meditating. You meditate and you learn from that. So as the boys are going in there, they're thinking about, the history of what their grandpa just told them about the Depression and how Frank Blair had lost everything. And so as they're going in there, they're thinking about that and about things that they want to get by walking the labyrinth. And maybe some of that will come true. And as they're walking out, they find they're not in 2005 anymore. They're in 1935. And they become they become chased by the people who lived there at that time. And they scoot across Lake Orion. They meet up with some hobos, and the hobos are young people. And that's something else I learned about the Depression was most of the hobos were kids, and a lot of them were 12, 13, 14 years old. And they were kicked out of their homes, or they left their homes because there was no food. Parents didn't have any money, no job. The only opportunities that somebody would have, whether they were 12, 13, or 20, or 30, was to get on a train and go somewhere where California, places where there were, crops to be picked, and they can make money that way. So the boys meet up with these hobos, and the hobos help them out. And they get on trains and they get chased all over the place by the police. And a lot of neat things happen in the story, but it's basically a lot of truth in a lot of the stories that I learned about instances of people who had extremely hard times during the Depression. A lot of people didn't. I found that out too. The Depression wasn't the end of the world for a lot of people. They went right on living and did just fine. I talked to Gail Kendler about her remembrances of the Depression, and she said it wasn't all that bad. Where she was here in town, and it was the life went on as pretty much as normal, and it wasn't until it was really over that she was really young at the time, but it wasn't all that horrible. So there was certainly a wide range of how people were affected by the Depression. I think a lot of people my age whose parents went through it certainly feel the importance of the value of things that maybe our children don't have quite that same attitude about, but certainly those who did live through the Depression recognize the value of just the most trivial things, but they, that's what I try to impart in the story too. One more story, and that's the story of, I took my fourth year of pharmacy and I was at Ferris, and I talked my dean into letting me see if I could get go abroad for a year. I mean, no one in pharmacy has ever done that. But some of my friends on Mackinac Island, that when I was working there, they were all talking about their year in Spain or somewhere, and boy, I'd really like to do that. And then I found out that pharmacy is something that you go abroad to learn. But I talked him into it, and so I started sending letters out to schools in Europe, in Great Britain actually. And I got accepted, lo and behold, to 5 different places. And one of them was in Belfast, Northern Ireland, 1966. Not a good choice, probably. But my family was from the north of Ireland, and so I chose that one. And they had a basketball program, which really sold the deal for me. And I wasn't a real good basketball player, but I was good enough to get on the university team there. So I went there for a year. But I also, while I was there, I started feeling the effects of the Anglo-Irish problems that were the Troubles, as it was called, and that you had to be. I played folk music, and I would go to those folk singing pubs in Belfast, and I'd find out from my friends that I couldn't sing certain songs. So I know this Irish song. I'll do that one. No, you better not. You just stick to some American ones that aren't going to get you killed, for one thing. And because you really could, you could get into some really serious trouble if you whistled an orange tune or in a Catholic pub or the other way around. That wasn't taken very kindly. So anyway, that was one of the things that happened to me when I was at Queens, and so I thought, here's an idea for a story, and all this stuff about bullying in the last 10 years, 15 years, Autumn, and that's been a constant subject. And so here's an idea. This terrorism thing is just kind of like teasing on steroids. Is what it kind of amounts to. So I took this boy whose parents were killed on 9/11. He's living in New York State, right near New York City, and his parents both work in the Twin Towers, and they both die from the terrorist attack. He has one living relative, and that relative takes him back to where he lives, which is in London, England. But his uncle is very heavily involved with the IRA, which to any British person is just another name for Al Qaeda. So the boy is just being indoctrinated by his uncle and all of his buddies into the IRA principles of the Irish and the English and the hatred between the two. And when he goes off to live, he doesn't go off, he goes to school in London to a really ritzy boys' school, which is all sons of lords and certainly the exact opposite of the IRA principled people. So then the boy has to figure out his allegiance to his friend or to his family's IRA notions. So that creates a bunch of interesting scenarios, and that's a story that just kind of recently came out, and it's one that's just very slowly becoming, getting some recognition. So it's by a smaller publisher. All of my books have been by smaller publishers, so I haven't had the advantage of having a lot of promotion. Most of them, they print the book and try to promote it, but they don't really get you into a lot of the award programs and things like that, where you get a lot of recognition. So that's I'm struggling along a little. I'm hoping to get recognized. My newest book is a children's picture book, which is it's this close to being published. It's being edited as we speak. George is a good friend of mine who's also a fishing buddy and bass master.
There's only 2 little changes.
Yeah, it's been revised a whole lot of times. This is a story about a tree. When we moved from Rochester, something very interesting happened. When we moved to Rochester to begin with, 40 years ago, longer than that, 71 is when we moved to Rochester, we planted a cherry tree. And that tree survived and blossomed and so on for a few years, and then so did our family. Our family went from 1 kid to 4, and so we needed to enlarge our house. And the tree was right in the way of where that house would be expanded. And so we buried that tree. By now it's probably 12, 15 years old. And so we very delicately dug around the tree and transplanted it over 40, 50 feet away. And lo and behold, it survived. We really didn't think it would, but it did. And so then another 30 years later, that's when we decided to move to Lake Orion, and there was no way that tree was, we were going to be able to dig that up again. And the day we made, this is really, really spooky kind of, the day that Candy and I came home and decided on this fabulous house that we both loved, and it was torn between staying in Rochester or this new house. We decided that day that we would put a bid on the house. That very evening, there was a storm. Lightning split one of the 2 main branches to the ground. We propped up the other branch, and it was surviving and looked like it was gonna make it. When the very day that we actually put the money on the house, that very day, that very afternoon, there was another storm, another lightning storm. The other half went. Just too spooky for words, and just the story had to be told. So I wrote this children's picture book, which tells the story of the cherry tree and the boy. The boy was able to speak to it. And the tree was able to speak to him. So pick me is what the tree is saying when we're going to Bourdain's to buy a cherry tree, and the little 2-year-old boy says, pick me. And so the tree came home with us, and 40 years later, you'll have to get the book. So I guess we have time for any more questions. I've got a few books here for sale, I didn't come here to sell books, but I certainly am willing to. Yes, question.
In Pitch in Time, I remember reading some references to the Underground Railroad.
Yep.
What did you find in your research?
Yeah, actually, there was where the building, Helen Williams, you remember, I used her house. She was on University, on the north side of the university, and I used her house as the fictitiously a place for where the Underground Railroad, where the Quaker family, and she was a Quaker incidentally, Helen Williams. So she helped me with the story because I used a lot of the Quaker expressions, and I ran it by her to see if those would be valid terms that a Quaker would use. So she was really helpful throughout a lot of my books. But there was not an Underground Railroad station, and that's another kind of neat thing about Underground Railroads. They were so secretive, and you didn't dare let people know. There's no historically. It's really hard to track down places that really were sites for the Underground Railroad. But no, that was fictitious. Yes?
Who was your illustrator for the picture book?
She's a freelance artist with the company, the publishing company. A lot of, no one I know, but a lot of my illustrations were done by my sister, Karen, who, when I first was writing my first book, I thought it was an adult book. It was just going to be reminiscences, and I thought it was going to be, written, and it was like 350 pages long. And someone said, well, it's a good kid's book, but it's too long. This is before Harry Potter, of course. That kind of blew that notion out of the water. But anyway, so she said, this is a really good picture, or a good kid's book, but it's too long. So if you wanted to sell it to somebody and get a publisher to publish it, you're going to have to chop it down. And I did it, and it made it a much better story, much cleaner and more concise, and I didn't lose a thing I found out. So, but anyway, my sister came to my rescue because it's a young adult book. It had to have a number of illustrations, and so every chapter has a different picture. And these were like this, and they got shrunk down to postage stamp size. So unfortunately, but they're really good. But she did most of my illustrations for my books over the years. Yes.
The Underground Railroad is mentioned. The Octagon House was another stop.
Yep.
I learned that in 5th grade.
Yep. But that wasn't in downtown Rochester. Although there was an Octagon House in Rochester, but it was not that one. Yes.
What would have been the credentials of a pharmacist back in 18?
Yeah.
When was your building built?
1890, but it goes back even to 1832 is what Roland Sprague was a doctor. Now I don't know what the credentials were for being a doctor either for that matter. It wasn't anything like it is now, that's for sure. I mean, it was kind of like an apprenticeship, I believe, with another doctor. You learn how to saw off arms and legs and do the things that surgeons and physicians did. Lauren, you probably know more about Lauren Sifrin's here as a doctor. And it was a lot different. It's changed over the years. Mostly apprenticeship, I'll bet you, is what like the kid in the story was doing, working with a pharmacist and learning about how to read fact, Lauren's in the story. Not, I think, one of his prescriptions. I forgot about that. Compounding, yeah, a lot of compounding, because you didn't get pills from suppliers. You got the raw ingredients and made stuff from that. And I use that as an example in the story about how Pillard Norton is showing Mac how to read a prescription and what all the various symbols that nobody can read So it's just a matter of learning Latin a little bit, and I mean, these are all shorthand for Latin terms, and it's but that's undoubtedly what it was like. I went to school in the 60s in Ferris, and it was pretty much like that then too. Any other questions? Yes.
I just want to say I have purchased every one of your books for our grandchildren and read them. Enjoyed every one of them. But the last one about the one iron, I think this is good for an adult to read as it is children.
Yeah, and I've heard that kids are reading that and really loving it. So and I'm stunned by that. But if kids can read those long Harry Potter stories, and seriously, I love Harry Potter stories. I think they're just fabulous. Her imagination to write those stories is really neat. But thank you for the unsolicited testimonial from.
I'm waiting for the next one.
All right.